Raymond had lived on the river for 23 years. His floating shack was anchored to a crooked sycamore at the edge of Stillwater Bend. The Blackwater River swallowed everything else, and its slow brown current carried away the names of people who once lived there. Raymond knew every curve of the water, every submerged log, and every sandbar that shifted with the rain. He woke before dawn on that morning because the fog had crept inside his ribs and made him cough. His hands were raw from pulling the net the night before, but he went out anyway. He rowed the wooden skiff with the quiet discipline of a man who had nothing else to lose. The net came up heavy, heavier than it should have. When he dragged it over the gunwale, he saw the face. A man, dead, with eyes open and gray as the river stones. Water poured from the man's mouth as Raymond pulled the body across the bottom of the boat. He had seen dead things before, like deer, raccoons, and a boy who drowned 2 summers ago. But this was different. The man's skin was cold and waxy, and his jacket was buttoned to the throat even though the air was warm. Raymond's instinct was to push the body back into the water and row away, but something stopped him. A lump in the right pocket of the jacket was hard and angular. He cut the pocket with his knife and pulled out a stone. It was not a normal stone. It was flat on one side and carved with a shallow groove that ran from edge to edge like a tiny canal. The stone was lighter than it should have been, almost hollow. When Raymond held it to his ear, he heard nothing but the faint hum of his own blood. He dropped the stone into his coat, then pushed the body over the side. The current took it slowly, turning it once before it sank beneath the surface of the Blackwater. Raymond rowed back to his shack and hid the stone inside a coffee can wedged behind a loose plank under the floor. He did not sleep that night. He sat on his porch and watched the river. When the rain started, he went inside and listened to the water drip through the roof onto his cast iron stove. 2 days passed in silence. He went out fishing each morning and returned each afternoon, and the stone stayed hidden. On the 3rd night, he heard the motor first. It was a deep growl that did not belong to the occasional pleasure boat or the supply barge that came once a month. This motor was mean, tuned low and rumbling like a dog that had learned to whisper before it bit. Raymond blew out his lantern and crouched behind the door. The boat approached without lights, but he could see its shape against the faint glow of the distant town. It was a flat-bottomed John boat with 3 men inside. The motor cut, and the boat drifted into the reeds 10 yards from his shack. A man's voice came out of the darkness, low and patient. He called for the fisherman and said he only wanted to talk. Raymond said nothing. He pulled his hunting knife from his belt and waited. The men stepped onto the bank, their boots squelching in the mud. One of them pulled a flashlight and swept the beam across the shack. The light caught Raymond's face through a gap in the boards. The man with the flashlight said, "There he is," and the 3 men rushed the door. Raymond kicked it open from the inside and swung the knife in a wide arc. The blade caught the first man's forearm, and he screamed. But there were 2 more. One of them hit Raymond in the ribs with the butt of a shotgun, and he fell to his knees. The flashlight beam danced across the floor as the men looked for something, not him but something else. The one with the gun, a man with a scarred lip and a missing tooth, grabbed Raymond by the hair and said, "Where is the stone?" Raymond spat blood onto the man's boot and said he did not know what stone they meant. The man with the scarred lip smiled and told the others to burn it. They tipped over his lantern, and the kerosene caught the dry boards of the wall. Fire climbed toward the ceiling in yellow fingers. Raymond lunged for the floorboard where the coffee can was hidden, but one of the men kicked his hand away. He felt his fingers break. The pain was bright and immediate. He crawled backward as the fire spread. The men ran out of the shack and jumped back into the John boat. The one with the scarred lip shouted over his shoulder that they would find the stone with or without him. Then they were gone. The motor roared back to life, and the boat disappeared into the mist. Raymond pulled himself out of the burning shack with his one good hand. He fell into the mud and watched his home of 23 years collapse into the river. The fire lit up the trees, and the water turned orange. He thought about the stone. Why did they want it so badly? What was inside it? He did not know, but he knew one thing. They had stolen his motor while he was inside. They had ripped it off its mount and cut the fuel line. Now he had nothing but a rowboat with 2 oars and a broken hand. He sat in the mud until the fire died to embers. Then he crawled to his skiff and pushed it into the water. The pain in his hand pulsed with every heartbeat. He wrapped it in a strip of his shirt and used his left arm to row. He needed to find the stone, but the stone was gone. It was buried somewhere in the ashes in the river, or maybe one of the men had taken it during the chaos. No, he remembered. The coffee can was still under the floor when they kicked him. The shack had collapsed into the water, so the can would have sunk. Raymond rowed to the spot where the shack had stood. He saw the charred planks floating in a black smear across the surface. He leaned over the side and plunged his good hand into the cold water. His fingers searched the mud and the debris. He found a shard of glass, a piece of twisted metal, and a wet leather boot. Then his fingertips brushed against the curved side of the coffee can. He pulled it up with a gasp. The lid was still on. He pried it open with his teeth and felt inside. The stone was there, cool and smooth. He tucked it into his shirt and rode away from Stillwater Bend. The rain began to fall again, cold and steady. He had no direction yet, only the need to move. The river widened ahead of him, and he knew that if he followed it far enough, he would reach the mouth where the Blackwater emptied into the bay. At that mouth there was a small station where a river guard named Floyd Ramsey sometimes sat in his green shack and watched for poachers and drifters. Raymond had seen him once or twice over the years. Floyd was a thick man with gray hair and calm eyes. Raymond did not know if Floyd could help, but he had no one else. The rain turned to a downpour, and Raymond rode into the night. The stone pressed against his chest like a cold second heart. Behind him, the river swallowed the last flames of his home. Ahead, the dark water stretched toward an uncertain morning. Raymond rode until his left arm screamed and his broken hand throbbed with a pain that climbed up to his shoulder. The rain stopped sometime after midnight and was replaced by a dense fog that clung to the surface of the Blackwater like a blanket of wet wool. He could not see more than 20 feet in any direction, but he did not need to see. He had spent 2 decades memorizing this river. He knew that downstream from Stillwater Bend, the channel curved east around a fallen cottonwood. Then it straightened for a mile before splitting around a small island covered in willow trees. He aimed for the left channel, the narrower one, because the right channel was deeper and faster. The men with the scarred lip would take the right channel if they came looking for him. They had a motor, and he had oars. They would catch him on open water within an hour, but the left channel was choked with submerged branches and shifting sandbars. A motorboat would tear its lower unit to pieces there. Raymond pulled the oars slowly, keeping his strokes silent. Every few minutes, he stopped to listen. The fog carried sounds strangely. A splash could have been a jumping fish or the dip of an oar behind him. A distant rumble might have been thunder or the growl of that John boat motor. He pressed the stone against his ribs and whispered to himself that he would not stop until the river ended. The first light of dawn came as a gray smear through the fog. He had made it past the island and into a stretch of the river where the banks were lined with dead trees. Their roots were exposed like the fingers of drowning men. He needed to rest, but he could not afford to stop. He let the current carry him while he flexed his left hand and tried to move the fingers of his right. They were swollen and misshapen, the knuckles pointing in directions they should not. He would need to set them eventually, but not here and not now. The fog began to lift as the sun rose higher. Raymond saw that he had entered a wide basin where the river slowed and spread out before narrowing again several hundred yards downstream. This basin was dangerous because it was too open and too exposed. As he crossed the middle of it, he heard the sound he had been dreading. A motor, not distant anymore. It was close and coming fast. He looked back and saw the John boat emerge from the fog behind him. 3 men still, with the one with the scarred lip standing at the bow and holding a shotgun across his chest. Raymond pulled the oars harder, but the skiff was no match for the motor. The gap closed with terrifying speed. He needed a plan, and he needed it now. The banks on either side were too steep to climb. They were muddy cliffs cut by erosion, with no trees to hide behind. The water below him was deep and dark, but he remembered something. An old dike had been built 50 years ago to divert floodwater into a side channel. The dike had been abandoned for decades, and most of it had crumbled into the river. But at low water like this, parts of it still rose above the surface. They formed a submerged barrier that could tear open a boat's hull if you did not know exactly where it was. Raymond knew where it was. He had seen the broken concrete slabs when he was younger and diving for catfish. He steered the skiff toward the right bank, not the bank itself but a spot 50 yards from it where the water looked slightly darker than the rest. The John boat was 200 yards behind him, then 100, then 50. He could hear the men shouting. The one with the scarred lip yelled, "Stop or we will shoot." Raymond did not stop. He aimed the skiff at the dark patch of water and pulled the oars one last time. The skiff slid over the submerged dike with a scrape of wood against concrete. The water was shallow enough here that his oars touched bottom. Then he was through. The John boat was right behind him. The driver was going too fast and looking at Raymond instead of the water. The aluminum hull hit the concrete slab with a sound like a gunshot. The John boat lurched upward and sideways, and the motor screamed as the propeller shattered against the concrete. The men were thrown forward. The one with the shotgun flew over the bow and disappeared into the river. The other 2 clutched the sides as the boat capsized in slow motion, spilling them into the brown water. Raymond did not wait to see if they could swim. He rowed with everything he had. His broken hand banged against the oar handle, sending jolts of pain through his entire body. He made it to the far side of the basin where the river narrowed again and the current picked up. He looked back once and saw 2 heads bobbing in the water. The third man was nowhere to be seen. The capsized John boat floated upside down with its motor hanging at a broken angle. Raymond did not feel triumph. He felt only the cold clarity of survival. He had bought himself time, but not much. Those men would reach shore eventually, and they would find another boat. They knew where he was going, so they would cut him off before he reached the mouth of the river. He needed a faster way, but his skiff was slow and his body was failing. The sun climbed higher, and the day turned hot. Sweat mixed with the river water that soaked his clothes. He drank from his canteen and chewed on a piece of hard bread he had found in the bottom of the skiff. His hand had swollen to twice its normal size, the skin tight and shiny. He wrapped it again and tied the cloth so tight that his fingers turned purple. The pain was constant now, a dull fire that burned from his wrist to his elbow. He thought about the stone again. He turned it over in his good hand as he rowed. The carved groove was deeper than he remembered. When he held it up to the light, he saw that the groove was not just a line. It was a channel that widened at one end and narrowed at the other, like a key or a guide. He remembered the dead man's face, the gray eyes, and the jacket button to the throat. Someone had killed that man for this stone, and now those same killers were hunting Raymond. He tucked the stone back into his shirt and rode on. The river passed through a series of bends, each one looking like the last. He saw the same muddy banks, the same drowned trees, and the same buzzards circling overhead. He passed a small dock where a trapper's cabin stood empty. He thought about stopping to rest but decided against it, because every minute he stopped was a minute the men behind him gained. By midday, he had covered 12 miles. That was a good distance for a rowboat, but it was not enough. The mouth of the Blackwater was still 30 miles away. He would not make it before nightfall, and he could not row in the dark with one good hand. He needed to find a place to hide, to wait, and to think. The river widened again, and he saw a cluster of old pilings sticking out of the water. They were the remains of a warehouse that had burned down years ago. The pilings formed a kind of maze with narrow gaps between the rotten wood. Behind them was a shallow cove where the water was calm and still. Raymond rowed into the cove and tied his skiff to a piling. He climbed onto the remains of a concrete foundation that sloped into the water. The wind had died, and the heat was oppressive. He sat in the shade of a crumbling wall and closed his eyes. Just for a moment, he told himself. Just to rest his arm. But exhaustion pulled him down into a dreamless sleep. He woke with a start to the sound of voices. They were not close, but they were not far either. They were coming from downstream. He crawled to the edge of the concrete and looked through the pilings. A small motorboat was moving up the river, slow and searching. There were 2 men in it, not the same ones from last night. These men were older and harder. One of them had a scar on his neck that looked like a burn. The other was thin and bald, with a pistol tucked into his belt. They were scanning the banks, looking for something or someone. Raymond ducked behind the concrete and held his breath. The motorboat passed the pilings without stopping. The thin man pointed at something on the far bank, and the boat turned that way, disappearing around a bend. Raymond waited until the sound of the motor faded completely. Then he untied his skiff and rowed out of the cove. The sun was low now, casting long shadows across the water. He had lost half a day, and there were more men on the river. The one with the scarred lip must have called for help. The whole network was looking for him now. He had no weapon except his knife and no plan except to reach Floyd Ramsey. But Floyd was still hours away, and the river was full of eyes. Raymond rode through the twilight with a desperation he had not felt since he was a young man running from a bad debt in a town he no longer remembered. The Blackwater turned silver under the rising moon, and every shadow on the bank looked like a man with a gun. He had stopped counting the miles, and his body had stopped complaining. He was running on something deeper than strength, a hollow animal will that pushed his arms forward even when they had nothing left to give. He passed a sign nailed to a tree. The letters were faded but still readable, 8 miles to the mouth. He had made it farther than he thought, but the last 8 miles would be the hardest. The river widened significantly as it approached the bay. The banks became low and marshy, and the current slowed to a crawl. This was where the big boats came, the shrimp trawlers and the supply barges. But at this hour, the water was empty except for the gulls that circled above the mudflats. Raymond saw a light in the distance. It was small and steady, a lantern burning in a window. That was Floyd Ramsey's station, a green wooden shack on stilts at the edge of the river where the Blackwater finally spilled into the bay. He aimed the skiff toward the light and pulled the oars with the last of his strength. The light grew larger, but so did another sound. A motor, not from behind him this time but from ahead. A boat was coming from the direction of the station, moving fast and cutting straight across his path. Raymond stopped rowing and let the skiff drift. The boat slowed as it approached, and he saw that it was the John boat from the first night. It had been repaired or replaced, and there were 3 men inside. The one with the scarred lip stood at the bow with a shotgun aimed at Raymond's chest. The other 2 were the same men from the fire. One had a bandaged forearm where Raymond had cut him. The other was holding a coil of rope. The man with the scarred lip smiled and said they had been waiting for him. They knew he would come to the guard station, and now they would finish it. He raised the shotgun, and Raymond knew he had 1 second to act. He threw himself sideways out of the skiff and into the river. The shotgun blast hit the water where he had been sitting, shredding the wooden seat. The cold closed over his head, and he swam blind. His broken hand was useless at his side. He kicked with his legs and used his left arm to pull himself deeper. The river was dark and thick, full of silt and the taste of salt. He swam until his lungs burned. Then he pushed off the bottom and surfaced 50 feet downstream, gasping. The John boat was turning in a wide circle, and the man with the flashlight was sweeping the water. Raymond took a breath and dove again. He swam underwater toward the pilings of Floyd Ramsey's station. He could see the green glow of the lantern through the murky water. His lungs were screaming, but he forced himself to stay down until his fingers touched the slimy wood of a piling. He surfaced behind the station, hidden from the John boat, and pulled himself up onto the narrow walkway that circled the shack. The door was unlocked, so he fell through it and landed on the floor. Floyd Ramsey was sitting at a small table with a cup of coffee in his hand. His eyes were wide and calm. He looked at Raymond's swollen face, his broken hand, and the whetstone that had fallen out of his shirt onto the wooden floor. Floyd picked up the stone and turned it over in his palm. He said nothing and asked no questions. He had been a river guard for 27 years, and he had seen men crawl out of the water looking like drowned ghosts before. He knew that some things were better learned in silence. Raymond pointed at the window. The John boat was circling closer. The men had seen the light in the shack, and they were coming. Floyd set down his coffee and reached under the table. He pulled out a bolt-action rifle. It was old but clean, with a wood stock worn smooth by years of use. He opened the window and aimed at the John boat. He did not fire. He waited. The boat drifted within 50 yards, and the man with the scarred lip shouted that they only wanted the stone. Give them the stone, and they would leave. Floyd looked at Raymond, and Raymond shook his head. Floyd raised the rifle and fired a single shot. The bullet struck the water 10 feet in front of the John boat as a warning. The man with the scarred lip laughed and raised his shotgun. Floyd fired again. This time, the bullet hit the man's shoulder, spinning him around. The shotgun fell into the river. The other 2 men grabbed the wheel and turned the boat away. The motor roared, and the John boat fled downstream toward the open bay. Floyd watched them go through the rifle scope, then lowered the gun and closed the window. He handed the stone back to Raymond and asked what it was. Raymond did not know, not exactly. But he had been thinking about the dead man's jacket, the carved groove, and the way the men had burned his shack for a rock that should have been worthless. He told Floyd that the stone was a marker. It led to a place, probably a cave or a hollow tree where something valuable had been hidden years ago. Floyd nodded and said he had heard rumors before. Rumors of a gang that used the river to move stolen goods. They would sink their loot in weighted boxes and mark the spots with carved stones so they could find them again after the heat died down. This stone was one of those markers, and the dead man had been trying to sell it to someone else. Floyd picked up his radio, the old kind with a hand crank and a long antenna. He called the county sheriff's office on the bay. He told them there was a boat with armed men on the river heading south, 3 men with 1 wounded. He gave the description of the John boat. Then he turned to Raymond and said they would handle the rest, but the stone would need to be turned over as evidence. Raymond looked at the rock in his hand, the thing that had cost him his home and nearly his life. He did not hesitate. He handed it to Floyd. The river guard put it in a metal box and locked the box in a cabinet bolted to the wall. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the water lap against the pilings. Eventually, the sheriff's boat came up the river with its blue lights flashing. 2 deputies took Raymond's statement while a paramedic bandaged his hand and gave him something for the pain. Floyd told the deputies about the stone, the cave, and the rumored hiding place. The deputies left to search the river, and Raymond was taken to a small clinic on the bay. A doctor set his fingers and stitched a cut on his scalp that he had not even noticed. He slept for 14 hours. When he woke up, Floyd Ramsey was sitting in a chair beside his bed. The old river guard said they had found the cave. It was a few miles upstream from Stillwater Bend, hidden behind a waterfall that only appeared when the river was low. Inside the cave, they had found 3 metal boxes filled with cash and jewelry and a ledger that named names. The gang was finished. The men who had burned Raymond's shack were in custody, and the one with the scarred lip was in the hospital under guard. Floyd said Raymond would get a reward from the state for helping recover the stolen goods. It would be enough money to build a new shack, buy a new boat, or leave the river entirely. Raymond looked out the window at the gray water of the bay. He thought about the night the body had come up in his net, the coffee can under the floor, the fire, and the long row through the fog. He thought about the man with the gray eyes who had died with a secret stone sewn into his jacket. He wondered if that man had anyone waiting for him, anyone who would mourn. Floyd stood up and said he had to get back to the station, but he left a key on the nightstand. It was the key to a small cabin on the bay that belonged to his brother who had died last winter. He said Raymond could stay there as long as he needed, with no rent and no questions. Raymond picked up the key and held it in his good hand. He looked at Floyd and nodded once. The river guard left, and Raymond was alone with the sound of the bay and the distant cry of gulls. He did not go back to Stillwater Bend. He did not rebuild his shack on the river. He stayed in the cabin on the bay for a few months until the reward money came through. Then he bought a small piece of land on high ground, far from the water. He built a simple house with his own hands, and he planted a garden. He never went fishing again. Sometimes at night, he would dream of the Blackwater. He would see the dark current, the fog, and the face of the dead man floating just beneath the surface. He would wake up with his heart pounding and his hand aching. But the pain always faded by morning. He would go outside and watch the sun rise over the bay. He would think about the stone, that small carved rock that had cost so much. And he would remember Floyd Ramsey's quiet voice saying that some things belong to the river and some things belong to the men who survive it. Raymond survived. That was enough.